John Newton was an Anglican minister. He was an abolitionist. But earlier in his life, he captained slave ships and he even invested his own money in the slave trade. John Newton, as an Anglican minister, penned the words, "Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found. Was blind, but now I see." Blind, but now I see. What does that mean for us? Well, welcome back to Love Wins, where the truth matters because it's the truth that sets us free. And that's exactly what we're going to explore today. Am I blind? What does blindness mean from God's perspective? And why is it such a common theme in the Bible? Whether you know this or don't know this, the Old Testament includes 39 different books. It is the vast majority of the Bible. If you compare Old and New, the New Testament's much smaller. And in that entire Old Testament, there are plenty of miracles. If you were to count them, I don't know how many there are. Even people being raised from the dead. But there is no miracle about people receiving back their sight. There are no blind people who get their eyesight back, except for one story in 2 Kings, which we'll probably cover in our next episode, where Elisha asked for God to make an army blind and then asked for God to give them their sight back. I could be wrong, but as far as I know, that's the only story of blind people receiving their sight in the Old Testament. Yet in the New Testament, it is the most common miracle that Jesus did, giving sight back to the blind. So 2 episodes ago, we talked about the man in John chapter 9 who was born blind. And his disciples asked Jesus, what's the deal? Did his parents do something wrong? Did he do something wrong in the womb? Why was he born blind? And Jesus said, nope, wasn't his parents, wasn't him. In fact, it doesn't work that way. His blindness is so that the glory of God can be revealed. What I didn't tell you in that video, but what we're going to talk about today, is the chapter before. It's a long chapter. I invite you to read it. I hope you'll read it. It's not a story chapter, although it does begin with a well-known story of a woman caught in the act of adultery, and we know how that ended with Jesus saying, "I don't condemn you either. Go and sin no more." All right, so that story of the woman caught in adultery triggered a question that rippled through the people. Who is this guy? And the rest of the chapter is a conversation that goes back and forth between Jesus and the people, Jewish people, about who he is or who he isn't. And it ends up talking about who they are and who they aren't. And the story is framed, it's bookended, by Jesus entering the temple area at the beginning of the chapter and departing the temple area at the end of the chapter. And when I say temple area, the temple at that time was complicated. There was the temple proper, where the holy place and the most holy place were, and the priests and the altar, they all did their work. Outside of that was a courtyard that only the Jewish men could come to. Outside that was a courtyard where the Jewish women could come to. And outside that was a courtyard where only the foreigners could come. And beyond that, there was an open plaza. So when it says Jesus came to the courtyard of the temple, it's unclear sometimes which courtyard that's referring to. What is clear is that it's not at the temple proper. It's somewhere in the surrounding courtyards. And that's significant because it signifies that there's a distance between Jesus and the temple, which symbolizes a distance between Jesus and his people. So he enters the courtyard, the temple area, at the beginning of the chapter. This woman is brought there. And then at the end of the chapter, he departs the temple, symbolizing that they control the temple and Jesus has no room there. There's no place for him there. In between those two bookends is this long conversation, which is more of a heated argument than anything at the end. In fact, the chapter ends with the Jewish people picking up stones to stone him. So it begins with them framing a woman caught in adultery and wanting to stone her, and then ends with them wanting to stone Jesus. It's a pretty violent, angry church. It's a pretty violent, angry time. It's a time of great blindness. It's a time of people being religious and thinking they see and thinking they know and thinking they have the truth and really having no clue whatsoever. And that theme of blindness, that's really the point. It's not so much about people who physically can't see. It's really about people who, in their hearts and minds, can't see. And before we go any further, I want us to understand, and I'm going to repeat this later. Blindness is a condition. It's not a choice. It's not something that turns on and off. It's not something people do on purpose. Blindness is blindness. So if you think you see, and you're giving a hard time to somebody who you think can't see, think about what you're doing. They can't see. Now, are there things you can do to help them see? For sure. And that conversation between Jesus and the Jews got pretty heated, certainly on their side. Jesus was simply trying to help them see. As the conversation unfolds, they claim that they are children of Abraham. And Jesus said, yes, I understand, you are descendants of Abraham. But later he said, but you're not his children. You say, well, wait a minute. Descendants, children, what's Jesus talking about? He acknowledges they are descendants, but not children. Well, if you're honest about our society, our time, there are people in your life who might technically be your family, but maybe aren't. And there are other people who aren't technically your family, but they are. Because there's bloodlines and then there's relationship. There's things that are true on a biological level that aren't true on a heart level. And Jesus said, yes, you are his descendants, but no, you're not his children. If you were his children, you would be like he was. And you would know my Father because he knew my Father. As the conversation deepened, I'm actually going to read some of it for you because I don't want to mess up the words or say something it doesn't say or miss something that it does say. So again, it's John, the 8th chapter. Gospel of John, chapter 8. We'll start in verse 31 because 31 is the verse that I've built this channel on, that I've built my life on, that I hope you build your life on. Jesus said to the Jews who believed him, because there's a crowd around him, some are believing him, some are not believing him. He turns to the ones who do believe in him and he says, if you abide in my word, you are my disciples indeed. In other words, if you believe in me, there's an investment. You need to remain, abide, stay in my words. And if you do, you'll be my disciples. And if you are, you will know the truth, and the truth will make you free. Well, in another place, in the same gospel, same writer, same author, he said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. So in other words, you will know me, and I will make you free. They answered him and said, catch this, we are Abraham's descendants and have never been enslaved by anyone. How can you say you will be made free? I could spend the rest of the episode, in fact, I could build a series on that statement. This is a nation under Moses. I mean, the French would say their raison d'être, their whole history is built on their God freeing them from Egyptian slavery. And yet they have the audacity to claim we've never been enslaved by anyone. Furthermore, At that moment, while they're standing there in the courtyard of the Jewish temple, they are actually standing inside the Roman Empire. They might not be enslaved in the traditional sense of what we think of as slavery, but they are not free. They don't get to make their own rules. They are not an independent nation. They are subject to the Roman emperor. So they're currently under a form of bondage. Their history is being freed from Egyptian bondage, and yet they make this ridiculous claim. How can you say we're going to be set free? We've never been enslaved by anyone. Could a person be more delusional? Could a person be more blind? Jesus answered. Verse 34. Most assuredly I say to you, whoever commits sin is a slave of sin. Now Jesus goes past the Romans and past the Egyptians and goes right to the heart of the issue. The slavery he's talking about has nothing to do with nations and work and ownership of people, trading of people. The slavery he's talking about is when your mind wants to do one thing and your body does something else. It's when you find yourself addicted to something and you can't control it. It's when you find yourself saying things that you don't want to be saying. It's when you find yourself doing things that you don't want to be doing. It's when your desires and your actions don't even correspond and line up with each other. You're a slave. Slaves don't get to decide what they want to do. They're told what they're going to do. And when your body and or your mind is telling you what to do, even though it's not what you want to do, you are a slave. He continues. A slave does not abide in the house forever. In other words, a slave's not part of the family. They come, they go like cattle and cars. That's how slavery works. But a son abides forever. Because there's been this whole talk of family and who they belong to and what their heritage is. Jesus is getting to the core. Therefore, if the Son makes you free, you are free indeed. In other words, God the Father, Jesus the Son, us the slaves to sin. It was slavery to making bad choices that got humanity in the mess we're in to begin with. And Jesus comes along and says, listen, you're a slave, but if the Son sets you free, you will be free indeed. Verse 37. Jesus speaking still. I know that you are Abraham's descendants, but you seek to kill me because my word has no place in you. In other words, the things that I've come to share with you, the things that I've come to enlighten your mind with, the direction that I'm pointing to, the kingdom that I'm building, you want nothing to do with it. You'd rather kill me than join me. You'd rather silence me forever than listen for 5 more minutes. I speak what I have seen with my Father. You do what you have seen with your father. This is where it starts to get real. They answered and said to Jesus, Abraham is our father. And Jesus said to them, if you were Abraham's children, you would do the works of Abraham. Before we go any further, let's pause here. The Jews claim Abraham as their father. Well, guess what? The Muslim world also can trace themselves back to Abraham as their father. So can other people groups. Bloodlines are bloodlines, but that's not what Jesus is talking about. If you were Abraham's children, you would do the works of Abraham. If you were his children in the sense in which I'm speaking of children, you would be like him. You're not like him. But you seek to kill me. a man who has told you the truth, which I heard from God. Abraham did not do this. You do the deeds of your father. End quote. We're in verse 41 if you're following along, or trying to follow along. Then they said to him, we were not born of fornication, of some illicit relationship. We're not, in our language, they would say, we're not bastards. We have one Father, God. So now they're ramping it up another step. Okay, you want to talk about Abraham? No. We're actually the children of God. And in some sense, that's very true. Every human being is a child and a creation of God, but that's not what Jesus is talking about. He continues. Jesus said to them, if God were your father, not in a biological or creatorship sense, but in a relational sense, if there was a heart connection between you and my father, if God were your father, you would love me. For I proceeded and came from God. You see what Jesus is saying? He's saying, I'm my Father's son, man. We're the same. If you hate me, you hate him. And if you loved him, you would love me. You can't have it both ways. You can't hate me and claim you love him. It's not possible. For I proceeded forth and came from God, nor have I come of myself. He sent me. Why do you not understand what I'm saying? Because you are not able to listen to my word. You're literally not able. It's not because you don't hear the sounds or the syllables. There's a barrier of understanding and sight between me and you that you can't cross. You are of your father, the devil. I told you it was going to get real. And the desires of your father you want to do. He was a murderer from the beginning and does not stand in the truth, because there is no truth in him. In other words, he doesn't stand with me because there's none of me in him. When he speaks a lie, he speaks from his own resources. For he is a liar and the father of it. Which of you convicts me of sin? And if I tell the truth, why do you not believe me? He who is of God hears God's words. Therefore you do not hear, because you are not of God. This video is getting long, so we're going to have to break up into two. So you'll have to catch the next episode to catch the rest. But understand this. This is not me saying this. This is Jesus saying this. That the church that existed when he was here, that had his Father's name on all their synagogues, that read the book that God gave them, that claimed to be descendants of Abraham and Moses, claimed to be depositories of truth, claimed to be the only ones who knew, and you had to join them if you ever wanted to get to, claimed to be the ones. Those people were children of the devil. So when a person in Jesus' day was choosing between the world and the church, they were choosing between two different franchises that were both owned by the same demon. That's what Jesus is saying. And they were so blinded by his deception that they could not see it and they could not hear. You say, well, that's terrible news. What do we do? Well, even in this chapter, there were some who were believing in him. And I'm going to skip ahead and tell you a secret. In the book of Acts, there was a huge baptism of people who wanted to follow Jesus, and of them it says there were many who were priests, Jewish priests, because Jesus came to heal blindness. It's the miracle he performed the most. Next episode, we'll come back and we'll explore what it means to be born blind and what the cure might be. We'll see you next time.